no, this is what you're supposed to do. These are all these questions you've got. This is how you do it. This is how you live. This is how you go. And he's going to get real practical today in the things that he says, right? So we talked a little bit about, he talked about what it meant to be saved, all those little theological things, and then we kind of shifted gears in chapter 4, right, where he starts talking about relationships and things like that. So today it's going to kind of be sort of the culmination of that. The greatest movie, one of the greatest movies ever made, is Karate Kid. Y'all seen this, right? So Karate Kid is the story of like a little loser kid who's getting beat up and bullied at school, right? And he runs into this guy who he wants to learn karate so he can fight, so he can protect himself, defend himself, or what, you know, for whatever reason, right? And then the whole movie premise is that Mr. Miyagi, this guy that he meets, then takes him through all these little tasks that don't even seem to make any sense, like wax my cars, sand the floors, paint the fence, paint the house, like. And eventually, you know, that scene, the whole like the movie comes to a head right there when Daniel comes like approached him. He's like, you know, I'm tired of this junk. You've been telling me. I'm just like working on your stuff. You're not teaching me anything. And then there's that moment, you know, like where they're out in the garden and he gets fed up and he shows him how all those little mundane things he's been doing this whole time were really teaching him how to fight. You remember that scene where he's like throwing punches and kicks and he's blocking them because he was waxing and y'all know this, right? I think that's what Paul's describing here. Paul's trying to explain to the Ephesians that all through your life you got these little relationships, you got these situations you find yourself in, and those are important, but they're not important because of what they are. They're important because of what you're learning ultimately. Okay, so and he lists three. I guess there's probably a bunch of them. He lists marriage, he lists parents and kids, and then he lists work. He tells you how you should act, how Christians should act in their marriages, how Christians need to act with parents, between parents and kids, and how Christians should act at work. If you're the boss, you're the employee, whatever you are, this is how you should act. This is how a Christian conducts himself. And then ultimately he's trying to explain to them that God puts these little situations in our lives and in the world to teach us how to act like Jesus. So it's important how we treat our spouse, but not just so we can have a happy life on earth. God is teaching us how to be submissive and how to live the way that Jesus did, and make us more like Him. So I think that's what it is. This is the Miyagi moment for Paul in the Ephesians. Okay, this is what you're reading in this chapter 5 right here. So here we go. This is chapter 5, verse 21. Well, no. Hang on. Yeah, so sorry. It's really 22. Okay, so 21 he says, submitting to each other as in Christ, right? That's where he finishes his last sentence. So he's talking about being filled with the Spirit and consistency in your Christian life, and in the darkness of the world and being the light, right? He's talking about all those things, and then he says, and you do all that submitting to one another as in Christ. And then he starts talking about wives and husbands, okay? And I think that kind of sums all that up, because ultimately it's a posture of submission no matter who you are in these relationships, because that is the one thing that we see in Jesus' life is submission. That's the one thing that defined him from his birth to his death, earthly death, is submission. It didn't matter what role he was in, he was always submitting to the authority in front of him. Even in the garden, when he submits to the authority of God, even though he doesn't want to do it, he even says that, like, this is not what I want to do. It's not real exciting, but not your will, or not my will, but yours. Right? He's submitting at every point, and Paul is saying that characteristic is what makes a godly husband. It's also what makes a godly wife, and a godly parent, and a godly child, and a godly employee. Like, that characteristic is going to be a part of your life, and you're going to be able to learn and practice it in all these little relationships that you're going to see on earth. So then he starts talking about it. So, and I know we've gotten through this, like you've heard all this stuff before, right? So, well, try not to repeat maybe what you've heard in the past. So the first one is marriage, right? So this is verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of the body." And then he repeats it, just in case somebody was unclear on this. 24. Now, as the church submits to Christ, also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. Um, I always think like that's. I don't think that's any woman's favorite verse in the whole. Like, I don't know that anybody's got like that printed up and carved out of wood in their house. Like, I just don't think that's just not the verse. Right? Like, that's just not. I know that has like that's a little bit hard, but I think it's brief, and then Paul kind of jumps to the husbands because it really is about the husband. It's really about the husband in the relationship, not the wife. But he kind of says that first, and then he keeps going. So here we go, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. He did this to present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own flesh, but provides and cares for it, just as Christ does for the church. Since we are members of his body, since Christ does for the church, since we are members of his body. Verse 31. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. He's quoting Genesis 2 there, by the way. And the two will become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I'm talking about Christ in the church. So here's the thing. It says the husband submits to his wife by leading her the way Christ leads the church. And then he quotes Genesis 2. I did a Bible study on Genesis, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. That was really, really good, and I found my stuff, and it had some points in there how husbands do this, right? So just how they should lead the way. And there's a few points. This would be great in an outline. Like, this would have been awesome to like put on a little piece of paper so you could write it down. I just didn't do it. I'm sorry, and I apologize today. So first was Genesis says that the man should provide for the husband. I think that's our role as husbands, is to provide for your family, to make sure that they have what they need when they need it, right? The second one is to provide spiritual, or to lead spiritually. That means that like the decisions in the spiritual areas are up to the husband. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. And I think you see that more than the providing. I think I mean, it's a little gray otherwise, but that spiritual thing, I think we as a culture, it's not always that way. Typically, in a lot of cases, I even know a lot of people that I know personally. It's the mother that carries the family to church. And a lot of dad don't even come. They'll just stay at home because he's tired, or he's got to hunt because it's that time of year, or it's there's something. I mean, just anything else. But it's the mother who sacrifices and brings the children to church, that makes sure the family does. Like, it's the spiritual leader, and the Bible is very clear that that is not how marriage is designed. And it's not a surprise that those relationships don't end up working out sometimes, because it was never intended to work that way. The third one is that the man should take lead in romance. Did you know that the first human speech in the Bible, you know what it was? It was Adam writing a love song to his wife. You know that? Think about that. The man, it's in Genesis. It's not the most. It doesn't carry a tune too well. But here's the point. Stop it, Glenn. Yeah. But it's a love song to his wife. The man should be like the man should be the one planning date nights, right? Look, I'm not. Let's just not. I'm not do like I do. Like, I get it. I'm like I don't think that way. But the man should lead romantically. Like, that's kind of how God decided that. They should be the one taking the initiative to budget for events and trips, and they should be doing those things. The last one is that the man should lead in sacrifice. Verse 31, he references Genesis 2, and he says that he should leave his previous life. The man should leave his life and cleave to his wife. Give up everything that defined him up to that point and cling to his wife and take on a whole new thing. That's a sacrifice. A lot of guys don't do that. Like, you better know what you're getting into if you're going to marry me, because I ain't changing. And like, that's just not how God designed it. The man should be leading in sacrifice, period. And then if the man is doing all those things, then the woman submits to that leadership. just as she would submit to Christ. And then your marriage, Matt Chandler is a great author, speaker. He most of the time he has good stuff. Either way, the Matt Chandler said this. He said, "A husband sacrificially loving his wife and a wife submitted to her godly husband creates a relationship that the world would never look at and say how disgusting and archaic." That's the thing. The same people that are just anti-Christian lifestyle, the same culture that says that's just ignorant and primitive and so like archaic like that. That's just terrible. They crave a Christian, a real Christian marriage, not just like a family that goes to church. Like when a godly husband is leading his wife and a wife is submitting to her husband and they are in submission to each other, that's what the world wants. But you can't get it any other way. It doesn't happen in a secular environment. Like there's no two unsaved people are never going to operate this way. They're just never going to. Unfortunately, a lot of saved people don't operate this way. This is not easy. Paul's trying to tell the Ephesians this is not complicated necessarily, but it's difficult to pull off. Because as a man, like if you're sacrificing and leading spiritually, if you're doing those things, that means your wife's preferences come before yours. Period. So when you're trying to decide of things to do, like Laura kind of hates this. She would rather me just decide all the time. Like I would never like, but I always want to ask her like things like, well, what do you want to do? It's not like where do you want to go after church? I don't care. Where do you want to go? That's not the same thing. Like it's when it comes down to I want to do this and she wants to do this, we go that way every time. I can't tell you how many terrible movies I've sat through. Just kidding. That's not a good example. But it's making sure that her preferences come first because that's how you sacrifice. That's how a husband submits to their wife. It's because I told Parker went to the Christmas dance, right? And he didn't have a girlfriend or anything, but he took a girl. They're friends, so they went together as friends. And this is like it's not really his first date, but they were just going. It's the first like event that he had any interest whatsoever going to. And I was driving him down there. And I said, Parker, you've got one job tonight. You got one job. He said, Dad, we're not dating. I'm like, I'm not talking about that. We got one job. Make sure your date's having a good time. That's all you got to do. Like if she looks bored, do something else. You just make sure she's having a good time. Like it's 2 hours. You can handle it. I have no idea if it worked out. I have no idea. They might have been miserable the whole time. I have no idea. But that's the point. And as a husband, your job is to make sure that your wife is doing the things that she should do and wants to do. Like that, her preferences should come first when it's a preference thing. In a spiritual thing, your wife is going to submit to you because you should be leading spiritually. Period. But if it's not spiritual, it's just kind of, it says husbands submit to your wives. And that mutual submission, that's what creates that relationship that it's not designed so we can be happy with a perfect mate in this world. It's designed so we can learn to live like Jesus lived. It's designed to learn so we can learn to submit and let that define our relationship. You see that? Like it's about becoming more like Jesus. It's not about being happy with another person on this planet. But now if you're like Jesus, all this other stuff's going to happen. But first and foremost, it's about being like him. He then moves on to children and parents in chapter 6. In chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, it says, Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. It's strange he says that because that's actually not the first commandment. It's actually the fifth commandment. So I don't know why he says that's the first commandment. I don't know. Maybe there's some difference to that. Maybe we can ask Paul one day, Nathan, when you get there. But he talks about honoring your father and mother. And I know that I don't think there's any teenagers in here. Yeah, but I think what he's talking about when he says that is like you've got the first 4 commandments is about your relationship to God. And then the last 5 commandments are your relationship with other people. And that's the first one of those. So I think it has something to do with that. I just think it's funny he says it's first. So, nobody else makes that distinction. I don't know. Either way, how your teenagers and children respond to you ultimately is how they're going to respond to God. And my dad told me this a long time ago. He said, how your children respect you is typically how they approach God as they grow up, because parents are the godly authority in their kids' life up to a point. When your kids are born and up to 5 or 6 years old, they don't understand stuff, much of anything. Of course, they don't really understand a whole lot after that. But until there is a point in their life where you are the godly authority, and then there's a point when they, when they're teenagers, older, they shift and they begin to lean on the authority of God. It's the whole obedience thing. So children obey their parents. You don't obey your parents after. I mean, you do, Nathan, because your parents in here. But everybody else is excused from this. But like as we get older, when we get to be my age, you don't necessarily obey your parents. You honor them. I think that's the distinction that Paul's trying to make. Children obey your parents. You honor your parents, and you honor your parents in different ways. It doesn't mean always doing everything that they say. Because as you get older, I know that there was a friend of mine who accepted the call to ministry, and we were in our late 20s, I think, at the time. But anyway, so they're like, I'm going overseas, I'm moving off. And her parents went nuts and said, no, you're not. You're not doing that. Because that's a dangerous place. You can get killed. Like, you can pray for those people. You can send some money to somebody else, they can do it. Like, she was like, coming down hard, and she was torn. She's like, how am I supposed to act? And I think there's a way of honoring your father and mother even into adulthood, but you're not necessarily obeying everything that they do. It's not the same thing, because children obey their parents because that's the godly authority in their life. But as you become an adult, God is the authority in your life, and you obey God and you honor your parents. Does that make sense? And I think that's what Paul's trying to explain here. Because how you submit to the authority of your parents as a child is how you're going to submit to the authority of God later in life. And so that's pressure on parents. That's why discipline is such a big deal. I don't, discipline is something that I don't see a lot of anymore. I know in the school system it's hard. We kind of see just a whole gamut of people and how they raise their kids. And I try not to judge people like based on what I see at school, because Lord, kids say all kinds of stuff. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. It just makes me think, what do my kids are saying? But discipline is a big deal, because how they respond to me, how my kids respond to my authority, and the way that I discipline them is how they're learning to respond to God when they get older. So I try to make sure that I do that. He goes on to say there in verse 4, fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. So discipline was never about controlling their behavior. Not really. Discipline was about shaping their heart and their approach to the authority of their life. So that my kids understand as they get older, I hope anyway, they get under that. It's not that I want to control their behavior. I need them to understand that there's authority in their life. And I'm trying to shape how they approach that. Right now it's me, but it's going to be God. Because it's God through me at this point with their kids. You see what I'm saying? So it's sort of a pressure situation, because I know that how I talk to them and how I treat them, that's how my boys are going to kind of view God later in life. If I'm always screaming, breaking stuff, and losing my temper and losing my cool and just coming down on them for every little thing and holding them to a standard that they cannot achieve, they're going to get old and they're going to think that's what God does. They're going to think that they can't. They're going to be scared to make decisions. They're going to push the church away. And they're going to live in a way that they can hide, because they don't want their father to be angry with them. So how I discipline my kids and how I teach them, and how I talk to them, how our relationship, I'm careful about that. Not that I want to be lenient, but I know that how I'm shaping their heart and how they approach God. And that's what Paul's saying here. Don't stir up anger, because that's not what God does. The last one is work. Oh, I also want to point out, I just made a note to myself, that almost every parenting instruction in the Bible, like the entire book of Proverbs, almost every one of them is addressed to the father, not the mother. Every one of them. That's not a coincidence. We don't see that a lot. And a lot of times in the family, the mother is sort of the disciplinary, you know, person kind of holding this together. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but the Bible gives parenting instructions to the father. Period. I think that means something. For me. That means something for me. So I have to be leading the house in parenting the children. That's my job as a dad, is to lead the way parenting. The last one is work, which I'll wrap this up real quick, okay? The last one is, not the last one, but, yeah, work. 6, 5 through 9. Servants, some translations say slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. This is the one that's always kind of, I don't know, it seems easy to me to understand, like how your work relationship should be, um, but then also not. Like sometimes I think maybe it's not simple. There's a lot of goofy ways to be like a Christian work environment, which I think are hilarious. Um, like if you put, there's, I actually wrote a couple down, or actually another pastor did, but it was a list he had. It was funny. So I'm going to read a couple of them to you because they're hilarious. Number 61 on his list was, you could put up a sign in your business that says, ask us about our exchange policy. And then when customers ask, this is what it says, let them know their actual policy, and then ask if they would like to hear about the greatest exchange policy on the planet, Jesus' righteousness for our sin. Like, I mean, you could do that. I mean, I guess, but that's not what it means to be a Christian at work. Like, that's just interesting. Number 60 is when a customer has paid his bill in full, send an invoice to him that says, paid in full. These were the same words that bloody Jesus spoke from the cross about your sin. I'm not sure that's good advice. Like, I mean, maybe it works, but I don't know. Could also have a opposite effect. There's another one that says, well, anyway, so I'm not to do too much, but like you can't always live that way. You can't always do those things. Like at school, I know when I'm at school and I meet with a bunch of people, we had a really contentious meeting on Friday at 10:30. It was, I kind of knew it was coming. It was terrible. But it's one of those situations where like I can't come out and give them a hug and tell them I'm praying for them, like because I know who they are and I know how they think about that, and so I have to be very careful about how I address those things. So I can't come out in a meeting like that and say something crazy, or she's going to have her NAACP rep sue me just like that because he's sitting next to her. Like there, but she's also recording and making sure she criticizes everything I say. It's one of those. It's one of those things. It's fine. It comes with the job. But there are situations where you can't act that way and get a positive result. There's situations like that, and it's knowing, having the wisdom to know. That's what Paul says, walking in wisdom, like in chapter 4. Like that's that, having that wisdom to know where your boundaries are. Also, that email that I was looking up about the little girl, that went out to the entire faculty, and the subject line said prayer request, and that's okay because I know that there's about 75% of my faculty are saved believers, and they will pray, and that's important. There's probably about 10-15% for sure. I know that aren't in church anywhere and probably have no relationship with Jesus. That's okay too. But we understand that I know where those boundaries are, and I'm okay sending an email like that to the faculty on our server because I know that it's okay for now. We'll see. We're getting a new superintendent in January. We'll find out what he says. But there are limitations on that. I can't bring that up necessarily in a parent meeting at 10:30. So you have to know where that is, and you have to act in certain ways. It says, to keep going there, it says, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Masters, okay. So slavery, like this is, there's a big argument that goes on with this, and there's a ton of people that really stick to this, and I've always struggled with it because when Paul says slaves and masters, he's not talking about slavery the way we think about slavery in the United States in the 1800s. That's not the slavery that existed necessarily in Paul's time. There was some of that. There's always been slavery. Slavery has existed on the planet Earth since the dawn of time till today. Like this, it's the fault of humanity. And Paul never shies away from saying that is deplorable. That is a terrible practice. It should not be. When he says slaves and masters, he's talking about servanthood. He's talking about almost, it's the same language as employees and employers. It's the same language. They just didn't have a distinction the way we did, because there was kind of that sort of relationship in every business. So think of when you see slaves and masters, think bosses and like employees, or employers, employees, right? That's what you got to think about. Um, he talks about, you can see in those couple of verses right there that the way that you act at work is a cheerful disposition toward obedience. I don't always get along with everything that my boss, the superintendent, says. I don't. Of course, the boss, the superintendent right now is a friend of mine, but he's leaving. He's going to Lee County. And the guy coming in, super nice guy. I don't know him very well. He was in Pell City when I was in St. Clair County, so I kind of know who he is a little bit, but never worked with him. So I don't know him at all. But he's a super, super nice guy. He shows up, introduced himself. He's a pastor, square, real nice. And he walked into my office on Thursday, and I'm sitting at my desk. It was like 7:30. I'm trying to get some stuff done, and no, or 8:30. Sorry, 8:30. And then he comes in. He's carrying a guitar, like he's wearing a guitar in his suit. And he walks up to me. He stops at my door and he says, "Hey, you play guitar?" I was like, "Yeah." And I have my old guitar in my office. But the only reason my old guitar is in my office is because it needs new strings. And I told myself about 2 months ago, hey, if I take this old guitar and set it in my office, I'll remember to put strings on it. Have I done that? No. But it's still sitting there in the case. So he walks by and says, hey, you play guitar, and there's a guitar. Let's go. And so I didn't know what to do, but like, he's my boss. So I was thinking, okay. So I got it out and I tried to tune it up. The strings are in bad shape. Tried to tune it up as best I could. And then we walked around the school singing Christmas carols and playing guitar to every classroom for about 2.5 hours. There's videos all over Facebook. So, like, if you see that, that actually happened. But it was impromptu and stuff because the superintendent just wanted to. Like, he just showed up when we walked around and sing carols. I could have said, man, I got time for this. There's 15 parents waiting to talk to me. I've got 25 emails I need to answer. I need to do this. But I just did. I just grabbed my guitar, got it best in tune. I went with him and we sang. It didn't have a strap. It's tough. You can see videos of me trying to hold the guitar. It's goofy. We also had a snow machine going in the courtyard, so kids were running around in the snow. We're singing Christmas carols. It was a good day at Kiddystone. But either way, it's that cheerful attitude toward obedience. And I don't know. I'm not trying to say that like every little thing God's ordaining that for my own pleasure, my own like thing. But I noticed this: like everything that thought I had to do was kind of still there when I got back, and it was okay. And be able to do that for the teachers and the students made a huge deal. And at the end of the day, I had probably 15 people come to me and said, "Thank you so much for doing that. That made our day." The kids loved it. Like I was like a rock star with kindergarten and first grade classes. They wanted my autograph. It was fantastic. But it's this cheerful attitude toward obedience because God has put authority in our lives. And I hope, I don't know, it seems like the guy coming in is going to be a great fit for us, but I don't know that yet. But I know that my job is going to be obedience toward his authority. And so when he has to say, grab your guitar, let's go do this, I'm going to do it. Unless it's just ridiculous, right? But it's that cheerful attitude toward obedience because ultimately my boss is Jesus Christ. God is my authority, and and my obedience toward my boss is how I relate to him. The commitment to excellence is always important. I think he talks about that, and not by eye service, not people pleasers, but it's doing the right thing for the right reasons. He talks about an attitude of servanthood. This is rendering service with goodwill. I've always approached God, no matter what position I've been in, as a servant. I try to describe this to the teachers. Of course, they don't always see it this way because I'm the principal. So they're like, they think, well, you're the boss and you have to say this stuff. It's fact. Like, I legitimately don't think I'm doing a good job unless I'm helping them do better. If they're struggling with something, I feel like that's a failure on my part. So I try to do something to help them. I'll come up with some kind of, maybe some training they could attend, pay for the sub for them, or go into their classrooms and give them breaks so they can go. And like, I just try to do something because in my mind, it's an attitude of servanthood in everything that I do. I'm not saying I'm the model, you should act the way I act, but it's a struggle I have all the time, but I try to act that way. I try to conduct the business that way. And then in verse 9, and we're wrapping it up, he turns it to the bosses, and he says, "Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him." When Paul said, "Hey, slaves and masters, y'all are the same," that was probably the most contentious statement he could have ever said to the Ephesians. Like, imagine that, because they're in the culture, they're not. Before God, they're not the same. Like, we got Jews, and then you're talking about the slaves that work in our houses. You're talking, like, that would have been revolutionary. Paul says, look, in Galatians, there's no Jew, no Greek, there's no man, no woman, there is no distinction. There are sinners, and there is God, and that is it. And what God has done for all. And we stand before God on the same level, and that means that I'm not superior to my wife in our relationship. She is submissive to me, and I'm submissive to her. We're not superior to one another at all, because we are all before God the same. Parents and children are before God the same. Employers, employees, we're all the same. And our work relationships, our relationships on this planet are these little laboratories that God puts us in so that we can learn to act more like Jesus. I think as Paul's trying to tell the Ephesians, look, everything's important. You want to live like a Christian? This is new to you. I get it. So you approach everything in your life the same way. It's important because it's teaching you to be like Jesus. It's teaching you to have the attitude of submission, the character of Jesus. And when you're said and done, you're going to have a great life. That's fine. But you're really going to be we're really molding you to be more like the image of Jesus Christ, which is the whole point. Right? And then the end of this, in chapter 6, then he talks about how things are going to get hard, and this is how you do it. And he wraps it all up in a few verses. We're going to finish that next time. All right? Then we're done with Ephesians. It's been a long road, but it's Ephesians is that book that's just God. There's so much in it. You know what I mean? And it's like Paul. Of course, he's also sitting in prison with nothing else to do. I imagine he's got a lot of time to think. Like there's just like I'm going to write, and then just spend 24 hours a day writing and singing songs, right? But that's that's what it is. And this book is great for people who are just new in the faith because that's what it's written for. It's people that are new in the faith. So if you have a friend that's like, hey, I want to start reading the Bible, I have nowhere to go, and they're kind of a new Christian, Ephesians is the place to go. That's tough. You have to help them. You have to help them understand it. But it's tough. But that answers questions for how to live, how to act, what it means to be saved. Why do we go to church? Why is that important? Like everything's here. Everything's here. It's a fantastic theological book. It's good stuff. All right, that's it. Let's pray real quick, and then we'll go. Maybe we'll have a seat in there. All right. God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for Paul, inspiring him to write down the things that are changing us and your words that are impacting lives 2,000 years later in a small town in Alabama. God, it blows my mind. But it just reminds me of how big you are and how this is your world and your control. So thank you, God, for that. Thank you for the assurance it gives me. Thank you for the peace knowing that I don't have to figure this out, God, that you are doing it. And you are directing our path. So as we go, bless us, Father, today with your presence. Remind us who you are. Remind us what this season's really about, and allow us to worship you for all that you've done for us. Give us the wisdom to make the right decisions as we go into our relationships and see those for what they are in our lives, so that we can honor you in the way that we honor each other on this planet. We love you.